StreamYard. And we are live with Surya Ramachandran sitting in a hotel terrace in Hyderabad where his second book is currently at the printers. What's the title of this book?
It's a photographic field guide to the wildlife of South India.
South India.
Nothing as fun as your book titles, yeah.
Yeah. So a follow-up to this one here, which I'm a very proud owner of. Is this with David as well, that you've done it?
Yes, very much.
Fantastic. Okay, so to introduce Surya, old and good friend of mine, actually met Surya on our honeymoon. He was the best guide we met in the whole of India. Surya is a man of many talents. He's a naturalist guide, an author, as you've probably ascertained from that, with the second book coming out now. Literally, he is the guy that wrote the book on Indian wildlife. I'm not just saying that hyperbole, he's literally gone and done it with his good friend, another superb naturalist. So fantastic to have you here, Surya. You're being completely ambushed. You've got none of the questions I was going to ask you today.
Yeah, let's have some fun then.
Well, absolutely. We start every episode with quick questions. Ones you should have a quick answer ready for. And then we'll go into some more intense bit of backwards and forwards and about conservation in particular. So starting off, the famous naturalist film, The Wizard of Oz. At one point, Dorothy shouts out, "Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my!" What country was she in?
I would guess Pakistan.
No, it was only be India, right?
Yeah, it is.
You're the only country with lions and tigers and bears, which I don't think many people realize. Okay, yes. What is India's most dangerous animal?
Well, I think it could be one of us.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And how many of you are there now?
I think it's roughly 1.3 billion.
1.3. You know what it is that causes that?
I'm not part of that yet, so I can say safely it's not me.
You're innocent. Yeah, I've got 2 kids. That immediately makes me a bad conservationist.
Does it?
You've got amazing photographs. I've actually put a link up to your Flickr account here. People can copy and paste it or do whatever they want to get that really spectacular photos. And you've got photos of incredible species. What haven't you seen? What's the species that eludes you? What's your bogey animal?
Well, I would say the clouded leopard. That's like the last big cat, because India has 15 species of wild cats.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen 13 of them, and the clouded leopard and the marble cat is left for me.
Right, and the marbled cat. Okay, I was going to ask. So you've even seen Pallas's cat?
Yes, very much. In Ladakh.
That's amazing. Right, okay. Very few people I know have seen that. And I've speak to a lot of naturalists.
Mm-hmm.
Of all these animals, and you've got photos of tigers, leopards, snow leopards. These are just photos. Obviously, you've seen so much more. Is there an animal that you're actually afraid of?
Elephants.
Elephants, okay. Yeah. Is that off the back of any particular encounter?
Well, I actually spent very little time working with elephants. As you know, Peter, in central India, we didn't have elephants. And in Ladakh, of course, in the Transboundary, we don't have elephants. So when I moved to the Western Ghats, we generally do a lot of looking for snakes and frogs in the rainforest. And that is an area where there are a lot of elephants.
Okay.
And generally, when you come across one, you're really not prepared for it. And it's a very different from the African bush, where you have a visibility of where they are. But here, it's like they just pop out from behind a bamboo clump or a tree. And that is, I won't use the word I'm afraid, but I'm most cautious when I'm in elephant country as compared to anything else.
Yeah, I understand that completely. If you're not that familiar with them, you don't have the experience with them. For years, I was like that with women. I lived in a tent in the bush. Come out and meet one, really didn't know how to behave, and I'm sure people would say that's still true. Okay, this is a question everybody gets asked. If you could bring back any extinct species, which one would you choose?
That's an interesting one. I'm not too sure. I mean, I think I'll put it as the one which is most popular world over, the T-Rex, simply because it was fun
Yeah,
watching the Jurassic Park movies. And I
yeah.
wouldn't mind an island where they come back alive and eat up some of our politicians, you know.
Perhaps best not to name which ones specifically because you never know who will actually be watching this. But yeah, I
Yeah,
understand that completely.
the more the merrier.
I did have another naturalist say T-Rex, and I said, "Where are you going to put them?" And he wanted to put them by the highways in the US to see if they really were scavengers.
Well, that does make sense. Yes.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to some slightly more in-depth questions. We mentioned the lions and the tigers and the bears. India's 15 species of wild cat in India out of a world total of about 30 something, low 30s, I believe it is.
For the 40 something now.
As they've split things and said it's different species, sure. So you've also got wolves, so leopards, snow leopards, crocodiles, cobras, antelope, and deer. You've got rhinos. You've got so many of the animals that people associate with Africa, plus all these things on top of the snow leopards and wolves. And why don't you have the safari industry that Africa has?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and we keep asking ourselves that quite regularly. The most important reason is we are still following the same systems left for us by the Brits in 1947. So, under the British era, and I won't call it the rule, under the British or the East India Company's era, the forest departments were under the Brits, and the Indians worked for them. So, it was like their boundaries, and which others weren't allowed to come into. But unfortunately, the systems they've left behind are still followed by our bureaucrats. So we actually call them the brown sahibs. That's like a local slang that we use because they still behave and they have the attitude that they know best, and the outsiders can watch, they can listen, but they can't act. And unfortunately, there is progress, but it is not at the pace at which it can be achieved if it was a more egalitarian system, like what you see
How
anywhere
many
else.
decades since the colonial era ended?
Oh well, if I do my math right, it should be 7.
And yet you've still got that same system of
Same systems, right from the judiciary to the police to the forest department to the collectors to anything. Even the names, their roles, everything is the same. And unfortunately, that is what is hampering progress in many departments. And wilderness tourism is one such area.
Yeah. Okay. So, and just to let people know, you're a naturalist guide, not just in any one particular place in India. You work throughout India, but in particular, as you mentioned, central India. But recently, you've been spending a lot of time up in Ladakh, the northern part of India, the high Himalayas, extraordinary for snow leopards and all of those high altitude cats. And what is amazing in terms of a tourism thing is it was not that long ago if you said, I'm going to go looking for snow leopards, people would laugh at you. Peter Matheson wrote an entire book, one of the great travel books of all time. Its title is Snow Leopard. He did not see a snow leopard.
Leopard, yes. In
And
fact,
now
George
it's
Charles
falling...
saw one after the book was written.
Right, okay. Yeah. And we went, it wasn't exactly dead easy, but as I said, on our honeymoon, my wife and I went and we saw 3 in the space of a week. Not particularly great viewings, but even those are improving all the time. So if this can happen with snow leopards, what's next? What's the next big challenge, animal to find to show people? Is it your clouded leopard again?
Well, the clouded leopard is going to be a much bigger challenge. But before that, I'd like to say, when I went there to work at the Snow Leopard Lodge and set up the Snow Leopard operations in different places, there was already a lot of groundwork done with regards to snow leopards by researchers, people from the Snow Leopard Conservancy, and they had already done. I mean, in fact, you were there before me, and you saw what was already done. And we just came and expanded on that and brought in a different dimension to it. But when I went to Ladakh, I was very clear on seeing some particular things which still hadn't been figured out. And one of them was the Himalayan brown bear.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so the brown bear was something people really had to go to the high Himalayas to see. But in Ladakh, you already were up there. But the question is, where are they? So it took me about 2-3 months into the western extremes of Ladakh looking for the possible spots. And we finally did find a valley with 13 or 14 brown bears just grazing
Wow.
in the open slopes. So, and we actually started an operation there. That's a different story for maybe another day. But there is, we actually did figure out a way for someone to come and surely see brown bears in the Himalayas, which is not possible in any other place in the mountain landscape, which is
And
great.
this is the same brown bear that goes from Europe all the way through across to North America?
There
Same
is
one?
just one brown bear species world over,
Yeah.
but it has, I think, over 36 subspecies or something, if I get my numbers right. So.
Yeah, yeah, and that's this week. It'll change tomorrow. But so have you ever seen an interaction or do you know of interaction between these brown bears and snow leopards?
No, I've not actually seen an interaction between a brown bear and a snow leopard, but I've seen one between brown bears and wolves,
Wow.
which I'm sure people have seen in Alaska and British Columbia also.
Mhm.
But what is interesting here is in Ladakh and in India as such, the biggest problem right now for conservation is the feral dog problem. There is no policy on feral dogs breeding in wilderness areas and taking over. So in Ladakh
Okay.
as such, because of the army camps and the mismanagement of waste, I'll put it that way, and the lack of policy with regards to feral dogs, the number of feral dogs are really increasing. And they are moving into these fringe wilderness areas, which is where the bears come to raid the trash piles and the villages for food. So there is a
Okay.
lot more interaction with bears and feral dogs as compared to bears and snow leopards. I'm sure that happens, but I've not come across. But the instances of feral dog and bear interaction and feral dogs and wolf interaction, including crossbreeding, is
Yeah.
increasing
Yeah.
manifold in
That's
sensitive places like Ladakh. Yeah.
it was quite amazing again being in Ladakh, and it's obviously it's so cold, and all of the feral dogs there have a long woolly coat. They all look at least like an Irish wolfhound in coat,
Yes.
much smaller, and it's a form of natural selection in an unnatural animal or a domestic animal.
Yeah, it's a very
Obviously,
anthropomorphic situation we have created, right? Because there is suddenly food availability, army camps with food availability in remote areas. So the dogs are spreading, and there's nothing feeding on them, and they don't die because of the shelters, and there's just disease and everything. So it's not great right now with
and
dogs.
yet
Yeah.
it's because unlike I've read that in other parts of India, street dogs or feral dogs are often controlled by the leopard, not the snow leopard. And for anybody that doesn't understand, they are distinct species. A snow
Yes.
leopard is a leopard. It can't just wander down the mountain, have an affair with a leopard, and they are actually they're as distinct as they are from lions and tigers and the jaguar, the other big.
I'll tell you something interesting, Peter. There's actually one camera trap sequence in Gangotri National Park in the high Himalaya, where
Mhm.
on a particular camera trap, over a period of 3-4 days, there was a snow leopard, a leopard, and a tiger on the same trail. Can you believe that?
Wow. Wow. I want to be that camera trap. I rarely want to be an inanimate object, but I would be that. Yeah, and
That's true.
I
Yeah.
mean, to me, these are the most interesting places in the world for wildlife. You mentioned the fringes, and the where two habitats meet, called an ecotone, is where you get the greatest diversity, the
Absolutely.
greatest carrying capacity, the greatest amount of wildlife. In terms of conservation, perhaps the most important areas, again, you've just mentioned, where humans and wildlife meet. That's where conservation really takes place. And in a country with over 1 billion people, there's a lot of those places.
It's all over the place. Yeah.
Um, I mean, what do you see good work being done in India in terms of human wildlife conflict? Are there projects you know of that are doing exciting work, interesting work?
Well, you were just mentioning the leopard, so I'll try
Mhm.
to give you two examples with the leopard. So everyone knows about the leopards in Bombay, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. So the leopards, there is actually one of the biggest, most populous city, the most bustling city of India, has about 26 leopards within its limits, which come down from the small hillocks which are between the city limits, and they come take dogs, they take rats, they take whatever they can. There's feral pigs, and
Mhm.
one of they do occasionally there are interactions with human beings where there are attacks, some fatal. But one of the most interesting developments that I came across there was how they were being reported a decade ago by the journalists, and how that reporting has changed in recent times. And that is all down to the work of one lady. Her name is Vidya Atreya. She studied the leopards over there. And she, instead of telling people to do things differently, you can't approach a whole city with your ideas. She targeted the journalists and told them when something happens, you don't write something saying dangerous leopard runs loose in the city or something. You say something where you try to write articles about how people should be careful. If there is an incident, you call it an accident, things like that. So that has changed the how these incidents are perceived, and I
That's
felt that was
genius.
very, very unique.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
I've
so
not
unique.
heard of that anywhere. That's
So that is just fantastic.
Yeah, there's a my wife's actually Prue, who you know has just started reading a book, and it's the title is just conflicts about wildlife. And I thought, well, they've got that wrong. But what they're actually the argument is not between humans and wildlife; it's how we discuss it. And it took me a
Yes,
while to get my head around that. But the point that they're making is where, from a Western view or from a conservation view, often we are on the animals and then the other people are on their side. And there's
yeah,
not necessarily the conflict there. It's we're working against each other rather than together. That's a really clever way. You change the language, you change people's minds.
absolutely. And
So
in a country like India, where there are so many opinions, what is reported matters a lot, and how it's reported matters even more. And I found that to be a great example of how people are bringing about change in human-dominated landscapes. But one other interesting thing, and I'm not sure whether you've been there, Peter. Have you? Did you go to? You went to Siana, right?
yes, yeah,
Yeah. So Siana, Bera, Jawai, these landscapes. Of course, they are landscapes of herdsmen. They're the Rabari herders with their hundreds and hundreds of sheep and goat. And there are leopards, which depend entirely on these sheep and goat to survive. There is literally nothing else for them to feed on. There's these granite boulders, and there are leopards and hyenas there that depend on the Rabaris for their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that has been
yeah,
the case for the last 200 years. But there's not been one incident of retaliatory killing, at least in a larger picture, or of a human leopard interaction in which causes fatalities to humans, again in the last 200 years, because of tolerance, number one. And more
right,
recently, the tourism industry has kind of adopted this lifestyle of the Rabaris in such a way that they compensate them through tourism to make sure the leopards thrive and the labaris still exist in the landscape without any regret. So these are the two very interesting, probably unique examples from India, because
yes,
human wildlife conflict is there all over the world. I mean, you have snow leopard conflict in India too. You have brown bear conflict. You have elephant conflict, but that is kind of there throughout Southeast Asia and even Africa. But these two examples I felt were something quite unique to India, and the way they were handled were very interesting.
that is fascinating. I mean, one what I love is that one is near ancient, or being 200, at least 200 years old or so, and the other is a very modern way where I think we all understand how the media
Mhm.
increasingly seems a bit bad. What a great way to turn it around to a positive use. I'm so I've never heard of that. That's just genius.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yep.
I actually, yeah, and you mentioned that Siana landscape. Went there specifically to see the striped hyenas. I couldn't believe sitting watching an animal I'd see for as long as anything else on those granite boulders you mentioned, and there in our little safari jeep, an elderly gentleman rode by on his bicycle right through the middle of it all. And in Africa, that would have driven me crazy. I would have thought, oh, this ruins the purity of it. But it made me
Yeah.
realize the bias in my thinking is that this is the
India.
reality. It's a fantasy to think that wildlife lives here and people live here. That's a fantasy even in Africa. It's the
Absolutely.
fantasy we keep portraying that most safaris still give people that idea. And I actually in India began to appreciate and enjoy that the reality that was shown.
Mm.
I still didn't
That's
like
true.
having a time with 30 vehicles around. That was a bit rough for me. Uh, but otherwise, yeah. So that's amazing. So you normally would you be heading up to Ladakh right now?
I'll already be in Ladakh right now.
Okay, but it's I mean I'm guessing no tourists at the moment, or no international tourists with COVID.
Well, we actually work with very, very remote, small, quaint villages in Ladakh. And
Yeah.
so it is not just about the tourism, it is about we are responsible for their lives too. And
Okay.
so we had a long chats with the villagers who work with us. They're some of the best trackers we know. Their families work with us. The kids in their houses. When I say kids, I'm talking about the teens in their houses. They work with us at times as porters. So there's the whole village is
You're not
involved.
supporting child labour. We understand.
No, no, yeah. So as long as that has come out fine. So everyone works together with us in one way or the other. So we really wanted their opinion on whether they wanted the tourists to come this year or not. So that we had long
Right.
chats, and they said, let's not do it this year. Let's continue from next year. And of course, the China problem started after that. So which kind of sealed the matter, saying no more Ladakh for this season, at least till March or April.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't think anybody else is watching the news and knows about the China problem on the border. It's an epic punch up. I mean, literally a punch up, as far as I understand.
Oh,
Indian,
it's pretty bad. Yeah,
but people actually died in hand-to-hand combat.
ab-
It was quite
absolutely, yeah,
extraordinary. Yeah.
yeah.
But no
So
shots.
and you know what is the most tragic thing for me? I mean, I might sound really horrible when I say this. We probably lost one mammal species to India in that battle, because there are few valleys along the border where you get the chiru or the Tibetan antelope. And
Right.
I think in this battle, it's not clear yet, but China has kind of taken over those valleys. So we probably don't have chiru within Indian limits anymore. Can you believe that?
Yeah. No, yeah, I can believe it. Yeah, certainly stranger things have happened. There's an example out of the United States. One of the most recently added animals to the protected species list in the United States is the jaguar.
What? Wow.
Yeah, historically, it occurred. There used to be a lot of jaguars, Texas, Arizona,
Yeah,
New Mexico. They all got shot out, but every now and then one still comes across from Mexico. But it was not protected by US law, so you could shoot it completely legally with no ramifications. And so they've had to actually change the law to add it to the protected species list for the occasional one that comes over the border.
that's great. At least someone woke up finally.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, these things happen, crazy things with borders, which of course animals don't respect. I mean, the snow leopards,
Absolutely not.
how many countries do they move between, the snow leopards that you're watching?
So there's actually a very interesting story with regards to snow leopards and international borders. So snow leopards have been recorded in 11, possibly 12 countries in the world. So basically
Right.
Central Asia, all of the countries. And there was a summit in Kyrgyzstan in 2014 in Kyrgyzstan. And there they declared the snow leopard the ambassador of the mountains to celebrate the homogeneity of the mountain landscape of Central Asia. So actually, a lot of dignitaries from different countries decided to work together to conserve the mountain landscapes, keeping the snow leopard as the ambassador. So it was actually an interesting summit in some ways, because a lot of things were actually done and not just spoken about.
Wow. Wow. Again, you're telling me something I've never heard of before. Oh, that's fantastic. Going back a step, we were talking about COVID and whether it's affected international tourism. It obviously has. Really interesting to hear that the people themselves that in these remote villages said we'll skip it this year. In terms of wildlife, have you seen or heard of any change in the way wildlife is behaving with fewer people moving around in India, or have you heard of an increase in poaching, for example, as because there aren't as many tourists? Has there been any knock-on effects with COVID, or are you still waiting to find out?
All right. So I'll have to go back to the first question I answered for you. The wildlife protected areas in India are still under the control of the Forest Department, who, like the Brits did during their time, withhold information. So we don't really get the whole picture.
Okay.
Yeah. But I live in a wilderness in South India. And I know that there are about 7 to 8 properties in that wildlife area, like wildlife lodges. And I know they were shut down for 6, 7 months in India. And what happened during that time? they were employing over 200 people in the surrounding villages. And because of their buying power of these villagers went down after the first month or second month,
Mhm.
uh, their ability to consume meat, their protein, was limited because they couldn't purchase chicken. So the amount of snaring that was happening around my house increased tenfold. I stopped seeing
Okay.
porcupines, jungle fowl, mouse deer, things like that, which usually are the prey to the snares. I stopped seeing them. I used to see them every day in my house in great numbers. I stopped seeing them within the first 2 months of the COVID lockdown. So that is how
Okay.
uh, distinct the change was. And I'm only talking about a small sample space, which is my house. And I can
Right.
imagine
So,
that being something totally different when you take it as in a bigger scale throughout India. Yes, I do feel there is going to be repercussions which we still don't understand fully.
okay, that's interesting that it's the smaller species that are the ones being hammered. I know certainly what I've heard out of a lot of the southern African countries, with the initial lockdown, there was a spike in commercial poaching, rhinos, elephants in particular targeted, but then it stopped almost straight away because they had no way to move out the tusks or horns. So that
That's
commercial
interesting.
poaching, and nobody wants to sit on evidence. You're
Well,
basically
in India, the
essentially.
contrasting different. Yeah, so Peter, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, but it's just interesting. So we had that spike in that. I have no doubt that the same sort of thing is occurring where small animals are being taken for food. But again, there's barely a billion people in the whole of Africa, whereas you've got a billion people in a much. I mean, India is a huge country, but it's about half the size of just the Sahara Desert, smaller than the Congo jungle. So you don't have the freedom of space that Africa has.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
It
no,
is.
that's
It's also the biggest contrast with regards to poaching in Africa and India, as far as my brain can process it, is the fact that it's a more commercial in Africa, like you mentioned. There are bigger players involved. There are sometimes helicopters involved, as I read in the news, and there are things
yeah,
like that. But in India, it is usually the poor tribal community which lives at the edge of the forest which are involved in poaching. So when they are not given money by an external party to, let's say, hunt a rhino or an elephant or a tiger, they won't. They will
yeah.
stick to bushmeat. So that's why the first differences that you see with regards to wildlife numbers is going to be bushmeat in India. And when whatever commercial poaching happens is done by them too, but only when there is a requirement. So it's a very different dynamic with regards to poaching in India as compared to Africa.
And are you seeing, say, domestic tourism returning so that people are moving within India, coming to the reserve, so at least there'll be some income for those villages? Or is that still that you're
No,
getting that
so
back?
yeah, so domestic tourism is actually picked up big time. It's been picking up for the last 10 years. The paying power of Indian middle class and Indian community and the interests have broadened. Everyone wants to get a camera and go take pictures. So all of that is great, and that's kind of actually coming in handy this year. But people still are skeptical about taking flights to different places. So the parks that are doing well are parks that have good feeder markets nearby, and the ones
Right.
that aren't doing too well are the ones that don't have very good feeder markets nearby. So it's not a very homogeneous situation throughout the country.
Yeah. And again, huge population, lots of different cities and different scenarios. And I mean, the diversity of India is so staggering. I think and I was part of this as well. I hadn't contemplated that it ranges from some very arid deserts with their own species up to these high mountains we've spoken about, across to that amazing northeast, which is lush. It's more like you would imagine Malaysia, Thailand, and that's where you're getting your leopards and things we think of as jungle type creatures. I mean, really
Yeah.
extraordinary diversity. Um, which is why I was very interested in what you haven't seen yet.
Hmm.
Okay, here is a tough one for you. Will there be tigers in the wild 25 years from now?
Absolutely.
There will.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do believe
Right.
maybe not everywhere like you have them now, because like you just
Yeah.
mentioned, India is not a homogeneous country. There are different attitudes in different places. But overall, I feel there are still some really remote wild places and some very tolerant communities in India, which will keep the which will pass on the mantle to the next generation and the next generation and so on. And overall, the education levels, people's interest, everything is increasing. The only thing working against tigers is the population, and people like me are helping with that. But overall,
I'm making you feel bad.
I'm going to take a negative every chance I get. But overall, I do believe there are some really wild places in the country still intact where tigers can roam free. Yes.
And you mentioned education there. How that is obviously so important in terms of conservation. And I certainly know, well, it is a global thing. If you educate women to the equal level to men, your birth rate goes down. But we also see that in terms of conservation, the more women are educated, the better conservation is. I had an amazing conversation recently with a man called Damien Mander, and he trains and runs anti-poaching teams in Africa that are all women. And he said because they just naturally de-escalate conflict, that you don't need helicopters, you don't need all the high-tech stuff. It's really quite amazing to think that. So, I mean,
That's
education
very
is, yeah, fascinating, isn't it?
that's pretty amazing to hear. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Well, he said because anti-poaching is not just boots and bullets. That's what I think people think of it as. It is very, very military. It is actually community relationships. And sometimes you have to step away, as we said, from just being on the animal side. Sometimes you might need to kill a leopard if that leopard is killing people. And that is something quite extraordinary in India. It was fascinating what you were saying with those community where 200 years and no leopard attacks, because Indian leopards, when they turn on people, they are extraordinary. The leopard is the third most widespread wild animal in the world. The greatest record of attacks in Africa is somewhere between 40 and 60 from one leopard. Yet there's several leopards in India that have killed over 300 people shot. What is wrong with your leopards? Why are they so cranky?
Well, I'll talk about the one specific 300 record that you just mentioned. That is, of course, Jim Corbett's famous story with regards to the man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag. But even there, at the start, he very clearly mentions that one of the reasons possibly for the leopard turning into a man-eater was the big outburst of plague that happened in the valley. So the people were dying at such great extents that they didn't have time to burn the bodies. So they just threw them off the cliffs, let them float down river, and just away from their sights. And that's probably what the leopards were feeding on. So that's what he says probably habituated that leopard to human flesh. I mean, or that is a very dramatic way to put it, but that's what he said.
Yep.
But I think with regards to India, really what's happening is space. There is an issue of space. And leopard would be the last one to hold on to a space as compared to any other wild animal in the country. Probably even more so than a deer or a monkey. A leopard will hold on to even a small patch of wilderness, even if there are buildings coming all around it. And that's what's happening even in Nairobi in Africa, or a lot of examples around the world.
Yep.
So that is probably what is happening. And most of the videos that you see of the leopards going crazy is the aftermath of what happens when the Indian mentality, the Indian mob surrounds them. And there is really no trained personnel or an educated veterinarian who's handling the situation. It's usually the mob that gets in. There's a huge frenzy that happens, and the leopard takes a swipe at multiple people. And that's the videos that really make the news and set up the persona of the leopard. But overall, it is down to space. And that's pretty much what you can say is the problem with Indian leopards. It's India.
Okay. I'll let you say that. I'm not going to quite dare to say. There is an extraordinary video worth looking up of a leopard quite recently, in the past 6 months probably, that was found in somebody's laundry, the laundry at the back of their house in Pretoria. And that was handled quite well. They stepped back, called the wildlife officials who came in and pulled out a young leopard, but still big cat, And Pretoria is a big city. It's one of these cities where it's twinned up with Johannesburg. They're pretty much touching now. And that is that extraordinary ability of a leopard to be anywhere, go anywhere that it wants.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever heard the one that in Lake Kariba in between Zimbabwe and Zambia.
No.
The Kariba Dam was built to dam the Zambezi River. And this, I always use this as an example of how adaptable not just leopards are, but every individual leopard can survive. So as the dam came, what had been the tops of hills became islands. And animals obviously got trapped on those. And I think about a year or two after the dam was built, they realized that out in the middle of this lake, filled with crocodiles, there's nowhere to swim to the far banks. A leopard was sitting there. Now, obviously, there were no antelopes sitting on there with it. It was barely bigger than most people's little backyard or footprint of their house. And it had taught itself to fish. And it used to sit in shallow water using its tail as a lure. And when the catfish came in, it would flick them onto shore.
Wow.
And then occasionally grab the birds that were coming to feed on the dead fish. And that just shows that every single leopard has this adaptable. Really one of the most amazing animals. So I'm looking out the window. I was joking earlier, I call this the Charles Darwin Audio Memorial Studio, whatever it is, just our dining room. And a massive truck's just pulled up outside. It might get a bit loud. You're going to have to forgive that. I'm going to have some Indian background noise for you in a moment. Okay, but moving back to conservation, what's a myth about Indian wildlife? Is there one animal that you think has a bad reputation that shouldn't, or has a good reputation that is horrible? What's a bit of...
Well, I'm not going to answer the second part of your question. I think I'm going to stick to the bad reputation, but it's actually good. In my opinion, definitely is a sloth bear. The sloth bear was one animal which is perceived even by a lot of experts and naturalists as a dangerous animal. And that is unfortunately so. It is an animal with a very poor sense of vision. It has a very strong sense of smell, but over a short range. And all of those factors play in big time into the persona of the sloth bear in India. And like we spoke about the human-dominated environments, the bears are there too, like the leopards in most of the places. And the bears feed on the same fruit as most of the tribal communities. They feed on the same flowers as most of the tribal communities. So what happens is when during fruiting season, there is usually what happens with a leopard or a tiger is when you approach them, they sense you before you sense them. And 99% of the time, or 99.9% of the time, they tend to move away. But the sloth bear, in most cases, won't even know you're coming. So it's mostly a panic reaction. And that is kind of what leads to 90% of the attacks with regards to sloth bears. And most of it happens during the mahua season. I think you were here during the mahua season, Peter, if I remember right, where the mahua flowers fall down. And that's our, like the amurula for India, where the bears get intoxicated on them, and the people also harvest them to get intoxicated. And that is where the conflict kind of peaks every year.
Right. I see. Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. It's a little bit like an adder, the snake, an adder. It's one of the ones that doesn't move away. And so there's so many cases of bites are with adders, but it doesn't mean that they're vicious necessarily. Because when I was there, you explained to me that I think most foreigners come to India thinking everybody must be afraid of tigers, everybody must be afraid of leopards, everybody must be afraid of this. And you said, no, everybody's afraid of sloth bears. And almost every village has somebody with the big scars across their head from the claws. And I looked at a sloth bear and I thought, they look cuddly. I don't know if teddy bears have become such a part of our culture that bears always look like something you cuddle. Maybe if we'd all grown up with toy leopards, we'd all be wanting to cuddle them whenever we saw it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just the psychology of it, but it was really interesting to learn. I have so little experience with bears that it's very, very hard to get my head around how to react.
Mm-hmm. In fact, we
What
have
is a
4 bears in
carnivore?
India. Do you know that?
4. Okay, so you've got sloth. Let me do it this way because I can't do this. Sloth, you've got brown bear, Asiatic black bear, and I'm going to guess over in the northeast you have the sun bear, the smallest bear. Is that it? Okay. So you have half the world's bears.
We have half the world's bears, and 3 of them, except the sun bear, have the same instances of conflict that we spoke about, simply because they all have the same senses.
Right. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's, I mean, again, going to the biodiversity of India, it really is quite extraordinary that you've got half the world's bears, almost half the world's cats, any number of dog species between wolves and dhole and jackals and foxes. And we did ask about what you haven't seen. What's the most interesting animal for you? You do great photography. I did put up a link to some of your photos earlier. What to you is the most satisfying or fun animal to photograph?
I think it's a red panda.
Red panda, okay. Now, so that's again high Himalayas, is it, or mid Himalayas?
It will be about 3,000 meters. 3 to 4,000 meters is the average altitude where you get the red pandas, because that's the rhododendron forest of the Himalayas, along with the very thin, nutritious bamboo that they really seem to prefer. So those two, wherever they are found, you get the red pandas. And there's one particular park in the Indo-Nepal border. It's called Singalila, and that has turned out to be a hotspot for red panda viewing. And again, like the snow leopards, a lot of the villagers have come together. They've become trackers, and they've figured out a way to find these pandas on a regular basis. And I don't think there's anything more satisfying than seeing the Himalayan light of the morning falling on the red coat of a panda, and it's all just green and dark, and then this red glows in that, and it's just absolutely beautiful.
That sounds like heaven. I mean, I keep mentioning lockdown because it's what we're living through right now. But here in the UK, we're in a second one. But what you've just described to me, it's just giving me the urge to grab my passport. Not that I can actually use it at the moment. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I hadn't even realised there were red pandas in India. They're in your head, they're so Chinese, I think, because we associate the giant panda. And worth mentioning, they're not actually related apart from far more broadly, are they? I think at one point they were thought to be because of the bamboo diet, but where do they sit now? What's the current thinking?
They're actually closer to raccoons, but they're actually a genus of their own. But if you, for general understanding, you could say they're closer to raccoons.
Right, which makes sense if you look at body shape, even the face of them is far more. Carrying on from 2 questions ago, so myth about Indian wildlife we've covered. What's something, a truth, a fact about Indian wildlife? One example or broadly that people should know but typically don't?
Well, Indian wildlife as such, I would never put that under one bracket, which is why I wrote a separate book for Central India and a separate book for South India.
Right.
So,
makes sense.
But in general, I would say people think when they come to India, they come with checklists. They come with big cats to see. Usually, it starts with the tiger. Even with birders, they come with different things. But I would say, unlike the rest of the world, the best experiences in India are outside the well-protected areas, like places like Bera or Ladakh in the snow leopard country, or the red panda villages in the northeast. So I would say spend more time in places like this, and that's where the real essence of Indian wildlife and the future of conservation and the future of tourism is going to lie when it comes to India. And that's where the better experiences are, for sure, in our country.
Yeah. And I think that's something which is true, I think, almost anywhere with wildlife tourism is people come, but hopefully what they leave with is the idea that this is, yes, it's great to see a tiger, but to have the tiger, you have to have the habitat. And by protecting the habitat, you're saving the lives of leopards and Indian wild dogs, golden jackals, any number of deer species, perhaps elephants.
Absolutely.
All of them get protected with the keystone species. I met a really interesting guy in India, and I'm sure you know him, who does king cobra tours
Yeah,
with
yeah,
some success. And that was his sole focus. I thought that was amazing.
yes.
I'm a bit of a weirdo, but I was thinking, oh, I'd love to do that. But
It's fantastic.
yeah, I was still on my honeymoon at that point, so probably chasing the world's longest venomous snake was easier than going to 4,500 meters where you can't breathe. So I've still not seen a king cobra. This has been amazing. I've actually learned quite a bit on this. One tradition we have on Deep in the Bush is we finish every single podcast with the most important question is, give us some good news. Well, that's a demand rather than a question.
Well, the good news is anyone can actually come into India now. The things have opened up.
Yeah.
The number of cases in a lot of places are dropping. I'm able to come to Hyderabad from my house in the wilderness and feel safe. So a lot of things are improving. And the one sure shot is if you start a company in India, you can come in anytime you want. So that is definitely one way to get into India for you, Peter. If you start a joint venture with me, you can fly in tomorrow to see a red panda. So that's how easy it is.
Yeah,
But the one absolutely essential good thing is the local people involved with wilderness are doing fine overall. There has been a lot of difficulty, but people from all walks of life have come to help. The domestic tourism has kind of held the whole thing together so that we can get past this year, so that we will all be ready and doing well when everyone comes back next year to see our big cats and our king cobras and our bears.
Which these, so tourism as part of conservation is such a huge driving force. When the government controls the formally protected areas, you've got to have the other sectors to actually help conserve the other places. That was the truck leaving right there. I was gone blind. All right, Surya, listen, that was fantastic. That was fascinating. Thanks so much. And I am desperate to get over there soon. If you do want to come to cold England, I can show you a kingfisher nearby. Not a lot of wildlife here.
I actually want to come to England to see the crested newt.
Okay. I can actually help you with that. All right.
Yeah, I'll take you up on that for sure.
Yeah, as always, we've got a spare room for you. So we'll see you soon. All right, Surya, thanks so much, mate. And we will chat again soon.
See you, Peter. Thank you so much for this.